The moment Fannie Lawson nailed that hand-painted sign to the post at the edge of her property, she knew half the county would laugh and the other half would simply look away, because a widow woman trying to run a cattle ranch alone in the Texas Panhandle in the spring of 1882 was either the bravest thing anyone had ever seen or the most foolish, and most people had already made up their minds which one it was. The sign read, "Help Wanted. 1 season. Honest work, honest pay. Inquire at the LAWSON Ranch." She stood back and looked at it with her hands on her hips, her dark hair pinned up beneath a worn straw hat, the April wind pulling loose strands across her cheek. The land around her stretched out in every direction like a faded quilt, brown and gold and pale green, where the new grass was just beginning to push through the cracked earth. She had 47 head of cattle, 2 horses, a broke-down fence along the eastern pasture, and exactly $212 saved in a tin box beneath the floorboard of her kitchen. Her husband, Cal Lawson, had been dead 11 months. Thrown from his horse during a storm, they said, though there were no witnesses and the fall alone should not have killed a man as strong as Cal had been. She had stopped thinking too hard about the how of it, because the how of it kept her up at night, and she needed her sleep if she was going to survive the how of what came next. She had a son named Eli, who was 7 years old and already looked so much like his father that it sometimes stopped her cold in the middle of a sentence. She had a dog named Preacher who was old and fat and useless in every practical way, but sat faithfully at her feet each evening when the dark came in. And she had this land, 640 acres of tough red Texas earth that her father-in-law had deeded to Cal, and that Cal had deeded to her before he died. Whether by accident or by foresight she could never quite determine. What she did not have was enough hands to manage the spring cattle drive down to the buying yards in Amarillo, and without that drive, she would not have enough money to carry the ranch through another winter. And if she could not carry the ranch through another winter, she would lose everything. And losing everything meant taking Eli away from the only home he had ever known and going back to her mother's house in Fort Worth, which was not truly a solution so much as it was a slow kind of defeat dressed up as one. So she nailed the sign to the post and walked back to her house and started cooking supper. He arrived on a Thursday morning, 3 days after the sign went up. Homer Norris came riding down the long dirt road to her property on a gray roan horse that moved with an easy, unhurried gait, as if neither the horse nor the man on its back had ever been in a particular hurry about anything, and had no intention of starting now. He was tall in the saddle, broad across the shoulders, with dark eyes set beneath the brim of a hat that had seen a good deal of weather. He was 29 years old, though he looked older than that in the way that men who spent all their time outdoors often did, the sun having pressed certain lines into his face that told a story of long days and longer silences. He wore no gun belt that she could see, which was unusual enough in the Panhandle that she noticed it immediately and filed it away as something worth thinking about later. He pulled his horse to a stop at the gate and called out in a voice that was low and measured, the kind of voice a man uses when he has learned that raising it rarely improves anything. "Morning. I am looking for the Lawson Ranch." Fannie was on the porch, mending a harness, and she looked up at him with the direct, appraising look she had been practicing since Cal died, the look that said she had no time for foolishness and could tell the difference between a working man and a drifter in about 10 seconds. "You found it," she said. "I am Fannie Lawson. What is your name?" "Homer Norris, ma'am. I saw your sign in town. I am looking for seasonal work." She set down the harness and stood up. "Come through the gate then, Mr. Norris. Let me get a better look at you." He dismounted and led his horse through, and she walked down the porch steps and crossed the yard and stopped about 6 feet from him. Up close he was even taller than she had estimated from the porch, and there was something about the set of his face that was neither easy nor hard but something in between, something patient and careful, the way a man looks when he has been through enough that he no longer needs to prove anything to anyone. "You done cattle work before?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." Worked 4 seasons on the Rocking M outside Clarendon. Before that 2 seasons on a spread near Dodge City. Before that I helped my father with his herd in Missouri until the drought took the place in '76. Why did you leave the Rocking M? He was quiet for a moment, not the kind of quiet that means evasion, but the kind that means a man is choosing his words with some deliberation. The outfit was sold last fall. New owners brought in their own crew from Colorado. That was a clean, verifiable kind of answer, and she appreciated it. I have 47 head that need to reach the buying yards in Amarillo by the 3rd week of June, she said. The eastern fence needs full repair before we move them. I have 2 horses, which means you would be using your own. I will pay you $30 a month and board. The season runs from now through the end of June when the drive is done and the summer grazing is set. I do not require anything beyond that, though if you do your work well I will give you a full reference for wherever you go next. He looked at her with those quiet dark eyes, and she had the strange, brief feeling that he was reading something in her face the same way she was reading something in his. That is fair pay, he said. I will take it. Good, she said. The bunkhouse is the building behind the barn. It is small, but it is dry. Supper is at 6. Breakfast is at 5:30, and I expect you up and working before that. My son Eli is 7 years old. You will treat him with respect, and you will not fill his head with nonsense. Those are my terms beyond the money. Yes, ma'am, he said. Understood. She turned and went back to the porch. She picked up the harness. She heard him leading his horse toward the barn, and she kept her eyes on the leather strap in her hands and told herself that she had done a practical thing for practical reasons, and there was nothing else to think about. She almost believed it. The first week, she watched him the way you watch any hired hand whose capabilities are as yet unproven, from a cautious distance, measuring the quality of his work against the cost of his presence. What she found was that Homer Norris was, without any observable exaggeration on his part, exactly as capable as he had presented himself. He rose before 5:30 every morning, which she discovered because she was also up before 5:30, and when she looked out the kitchen window the light in the barn was already on. He rode the eastern fence line the first 2 days and came back with a precise account of every section that needed replacing, organized in order of urgency. And when she asked him how he had learned to assess fence work so efficiently, he said simply, "A bad fence in the wrong place costs you more than time," which struck her as the kind of thing that was obvious once someone said it, but that you somehow had to earn the right to say. He worked the fence repairs with a focus and economy of effort that she found quietly impressive. He did not waste motion, and he did not complain, and at the end of each day he came in for supper, ate what she put in front of him with sincere appreciation, spoke respectfully and not excessively, and then went back to the bunkhouse. He was clean, which mattered more than people who had not lived in close quarters with a dirty man would ever fully understand. What she had not entirely anticipated was the effect he would have on Eli. Her son had been quiet and watchful since his father's death in a way that worried her sometimes, the way a child can carry grief without knowing how to put it down. He had his father's same dark hair and his same way of sitting very still when he was thinking hard about something. When Homer first arrived, Eli watched him from the porch for 2 full days before approaching him, and Fannie watched the approach from the kitchen window with her heart doing something complicated in her chest. Homer was at the water trough, washing the dust from his arms after the morning's fence work, when Eli walked up and stood about 3 feet behind him and said, very seriously, "My daddy used to work that fence." Homer straightened and turned to look at the boy without any of the exaggerated brightness that adults sometimes put on when addressing children, without the false enthusiasm that children can always detect as a kind of condescension. He looked at Eli the same way he looked at Fannie, directly and with full attention. "I figured he must have," Homer said. "It was well built, just time that got to it." Eli considered this. "Were you a daddy's boy or a mama's boy?" he asked. Homer appeared to take this question seriously. Both, I think. My father taught me to work and my mother taught me to think about whether the work was worth doing. Between them, I turned out passable. Eli smiled, and it was the first full smile Fannie had seen from her son in several months, and it went straight through her like an arrow, finding the center of something she had not known was exposed. After that, Eli took to following Homer around in the evenings after his school lessons were done, asking the kind of relentless, specific questions that only 7-year-old boys think to ask, about horses and rope, and which side of the sky you watch for weather, and why steers move differently from bulls, and whether a man could ever really talk to a horse, or if that was just something people said. Homer answered every question with the same patient seriousness he brought to everything else, and Fannie began to understand that this man's calmness was not the calmness of someone who had never felt anything deeply, but rather the calmness of someone who had learned how to hold what they felt without letting it run loose and make a mess. The second week brought rain, which was both a blessing for the grass and a complication for the fence repairs, and Homer worked through it 2 days running with the quiet endurance of a man who has accepted long ago that the weather does not adjust itself to human schedules. On the second rainy evening, he came in for supper soaked through, and Fannie handed him a dry shirt that had been Cal's and told him to change in the mudroom, and he did so without comment, though she noticed that he folded the shirt carefully before setting it on the shelf when he was done, as if he understood that it was not an ordinary shirt and that she had offered it as a practical gesture and not an invitation toward any kind of sentiment. They ate supper that evening with the rain knocking at the windows, and Eli fell asleep at the table over his biscuit, which made Fannie laugh softly, and she looked up from her laughing to find Homer watching her with a look on his face that he quickly replaced with something more neutral, but not quite quickly enough. She carried Eli to bed and came back to the kitchen and poured herself a second cup of coffee and sat down at the table again. Homer was still sitting across from her, though she had half expected him to take his leave when she went to put Eli down. "You have been doing this alone since last spring?" he asked. It was the first personal question he had asked her in 2 weeks, and the fact that he had waited 2 weeks to ask it told her something. "Since May of last year," she said. "My husband died May 4th. I am sorry for that." "Thank you." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at the lamp flame. "The hardest part was the cattle. I did not know cattle well enough when Cal died. He had always managed that end of things, and I managed the house and the accounts, and there was a logic to the division, but it left me unprepared." "You seem to know them reasonably well now," Homer said. She looked at him. "I had to learn in a hurry." "There is nothing like necessity to quicken the education," he nodded slowly. "My mother used to say that trouble is just a very impatient teacher." She found herself smiling at that. "She sounds like a wise woman." "She was," he said. "She died in '78 fever." "I am sorry." "Thank you." He said it the same way she had, simply and without the performance of grief, the way you say it when enough time has passed that the wound is healed, but the scar is still something you are aware of now and then, like a change in the weather that you can feel in an old bone. They sat quietly for a moment, and it was not an uncomfortable quiet, but rather the opposite, the kind of quiet that two people fall into when they have said enough real things to each other that silence feels like a continuation rather than an absence. "I appreciate you taking the position," she said finally. "I was not sure anyone would come." "Why is that?" "People in town have certain opinions about a woman trying to run a ranch alone," she said, and there was a dry edge to her voice that acknowledged the absurdity without asking for sympathy. "Some of those opinions extend to the people who work for her. I had one man come out the first day after the sign went up and tell me he would take the job if I agreed to transfer the title management to a male supervisor of the county's choosing. He said it would be better for the herd." Homer's jaw tightened very slightly. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that the herd had survived just fine under my management for 11 months, and that he was welcome to leave my property at his earliest convenience." Homer was quiet for a moment, and then something moved across his face that was not quite a smile, but was certainly a relative of one. "Good," he said. It was a single word and a small one, but it sat in her chest in a way that was warm and particular, because what he meant by it was not just that she had handled the situation correctly, but that he was on her side of it, that he understood what was at stake and did not question her right to be the one making the decisions here. After 11 months of being alternately pitied and undermined by people who thought they were helping, it was remarkable how much that one word meant. She told herself again, going up to bed that night, that this was a practical arrangement. She told herself that he was a hired hand, an honest and capable one, but a hired hand nonetheless, and that she was a lonely widow who was grateful for competent company and should not mistake gratitude for something else. She told herself all of this very firmly. The problem was that she was beginning to suspect she was right about what she was feeling and wrong about what she was calling it. By the third week, the eastern fence was done, the herd was in good health, and the working rhythm of the ranch had settled into something that felt, to Fanny's somewhat alarmed recognition, almost like a family's rhythm. Homer was up early and at work before she even had the fire going in the stove. By the time she had breakfast ready and Eli was up and fed and set to his morning lessons, Homer was already back from the first check of the herd and coming through the door with the kind of easy familiarity of someone who knows where the hooks are and which floorboards creak. He never overstepped, never presumed, never let his presence become any kind of imposition, but he was there, steady as the fence posts he had driven into the red earth, and she was aware of him in a way that she had not been aware of anyone in a very long time. She was also becoming aware, with a clarity that both delighted and terrified her, that he was aware of her in much the same way. It was in the small things. The way he oriented toward her when she came into any room, not obtrusively, not in a way that a stranger would notice, but in the way a compass needle orients to north, a small involuntary adjustment of his attention. The way he found reasons to be near her when they were working, not annoyingly so, but as if proximity to her was one of the reasonable organizing principles by which he arranged his days. The way he listened when she talked, not with the distracted half-attention that passes for listening in people whose minds are already forming their next response, but with his full and genuine interest, as if what she was saying mattered not only because the information was useful, but because it was hers. She found, to her own surprise, that she was doing the same things. That she noticed his laugh, which was quiet and real and happened when something was genuinely funny rather than when social custom required it. That she paid attention to what he said at supper with more interest than the practical content of the conversation strictly required. That she had begun, without entirely intending to wear her better dress to supper most evenings instead of the working clothes she usually stayed in all day. Eli, 7 years old and uncomplicated by adult reticence, simply announced one evening at the supper table, "I think you like each other." There was a silence of approximately 3 seconds in which Fanny focused intently on her fork and Homer took a deliberate sip of his coffee. "Mr. Norris is a very good worker," Fanny said. "That is not what I said," Eli replied, with the serene logical precision of a child who has not yet learned that some observations are not meant to be pursued. Homer set down his coffee cup and looked at Eli with a perfectly straight face. "Your mother is my employer, Eli. It is important that we keep a respectful professional arrangement." Eli looked back and forth between the two of them. "What does professional mean?" "It means they like each other, but they are not ready to say so yet," Homer told him. Fanny's head came up fast and she met Homer's eyes across the table, and he looked back at her with that quiet, direct regard, and an expression that was either very brave or very reckless. And after a moment she pressed her lips together to keep from laughing and looked back at her plate. "Oh," said Eli, entirely satisfied, and went back to his supper. After supper, after Eli was in bed, Homer lingered at the door with his hat in his hands, the way he did most evenings, the small ceremony of departure that had somehow become one of the reliable small pleasures of her day. "I should not have said that," he said. "No," she agreed. "You probably should not have. But I am not entirely sorry I did." She looked at him. The lamplight was warm on the angles of his face, and the evening had gone deep blue outside the windows, and somewhere out in the pasture one of the cattle lowed, a long, low sound that traveled all the way to where they were standing as if the night were carrying it. "Neither am I," she said, and the honesty of it surprised her even as it came out, but she did not take it back. He nodded once, settled his hat on his head, and went out into the blue evening, and she closed the door and stood with her back against it for a moment with her eyes closed, listening to his footsteps on the porch boards, and then the soft crunch of his boots in the dirt yard, fading toward the bunkhouse. The following Saturday, the town of Dalhart held its spring market day, which was the first significant social gathering since the winter, and which Fanny had been attending every year since she married Cal and moved out to the Panhandle. She went into town with Eli in the buckboard, and Homer rode alongside on his gray roan, because there were supplies needed, and also because the cattle supply merchant there carried a particular kind of salt block that Homer wanted her herd on before the summer heat set in. The market was held in the wide dirt square at the center of town, between the general store and the feed merchant, and it was crowded in the way that events are crowded when the winter has been long and people are hungry for the company of other people. There were stalls selling preserved goods and seed and tools and fabric and sugar candy for children, and there was a fiddle player under the awning of the mercantile who had been playing the same 4 songs in rotation for as long as anyone could remember, which was either comforting or maddening depending on your disposition. Fanny was at the dry goods stall, looking at thread colors and half listening to Eli describe to her with great seriousness the relative merits of 2 different penny candies, when she became aware of Mrs. Edna Prout standing beside her, which was never an entirely comfortable awareness because Edna Prout was the sort of woman who treated all conversation as an opportunity for intelligence gathering. "Fannie Lawson," Edna said, with the bright, targeted smile of a person who already knows exactly what they are about to say, "I hear you have taken on a hand out at the ranch." "I have," Fanny said evenly. "Homer Norris. He came well recommended from the Rocking M." Edna's eyes moved across the square to where Homer was at the feed merchant stall talking to old Gerald Purvis about salt blocks. "He is not from around here." "Most people are not from around here originally," Fanny said, "including both of us." Edna gave a small, tolerant laugh that acknowledged the point while declining to be deflected by it. "I only mean to say, a woman living alone with a child and a man on the property, it is the sort of thing people notice." Fanny put down the spool of thread she had been examining and turned to look at Edna Prout with the full, direct, undiluted regard that she had been learning to deploy over the past 11 months, the look that said she was not frightened, not embarrassed, and had no appetite for the particular variety of concern being offered. "People also noticed when I said I was going to keep the ranch running after Cal died," she said. "And when I repaired the eastern fence, and when I kept the herd through the winter without losing a single head. People notice a great deal of things, Edna. I have found that the noticing generally says more about the people doing it than about the thing being noticed." Edna opened her mouth and closed it again. "Tell me about your new curtains," Fanny said pleasantly. "I heard from Ruth Mackey that you ordered them from the catalog and they are very fine." By midday Fanny had her supplies loaded in the buckboard, and Eli had been given his penny candy and Homer had found his salt blocks, and they were standing together at the edge of the square, while the fiddle player began his 5th run through Lorna. And the day was warm and smelled of dust, and roasting corn and horse, and the particular sweetness of dried goods, and the air was bright with the particular quality of May light on the Panhandle, which was vast and clear and slightly merciless. Homer said, looking out at the crowd. "You handled that woman with considerable elegance." Fannie looked at him sideways. "Were you watching?" "I was in earshot," he said. "I considered intervening, but it was clear you did not need it." "No," she said. "I did not." He looked at her then, and the look was warm and unhurried and admiring in a way that was not the least bit condescending, but was rather the admiration of an equal for an equal, someone recognizing in another person a quality they understand and respect, because they have had to develop something similar in themselves. "No," he said again, quietly, as if he were agreeing with something she had not said aloud. "You did not." Eli appeared from between their legs with a candy-sticky face, and announced that he wanted to hear more of the fiddle music and could they stay a little longer, please. And so they stayed a little longer, and the three of them stood at the edge of the square in the bright May air, while the fiddle player worked through his repertoire one more time, and the town moved around them in its Saturday patterns, and Fannie was struck with the sudden clarity of something she had been trying not to see. By how natural the three of them looked standing there together. She looked at Homer. He was watching Eli with an expression on his face that was unguarded in a way his face rarely was, something open and warm and gently wondering, like a man who has been handed something unexpected and is just beginning to understand its value. He glanced over and caught her looking, and neither of them looked away. They rode home in the late afternoon, with the sun going orange and low and long shadows running out across the grass before them, and Eli fell asleep against Fannie's side in the buckboard seat within 15 minutes of leaving town, because he always fell asleep on the way home from market day, had done it every year of his life. And she held him against her with one arm and drove with the other, and Homer rode alongside on the roan, and they did not talk much, but the silence between them had become by now a rich and comfortable thing, full of the kind of wordless understanding that usually takes years to build between two people. Somewhere along the road home he said, without looking at her, "I want you to know something." "What is that?" she said. "I have worked for a number of people in my life," he said, "and I have respected most of them in the way you respect a good employer. But what I feel when I am working on this land and at this table and in this place is something different from that. I want you to know that, even if I do not have any claim to say so." She let the silence hold for a moment, watching the orange light moving on the grass ahead of them. "You do not need a claim to say a true thing," she said. He looked at her then, and something in his face changed, something quietly seismic, like a door opening inward. They did not speak of it further that evening, but the thing had been named between them, at least in its approximate shape, and named things have a way of taking up more space than unnamed ones. June arrived with heat and the particular urgency of the weeks before a cattle drive, and the ranch became a place of concentrated, purposeful activity that left little time for anything except the work directly in front of them. Homer proved himself in those preparatory weeks to be not only a skilled cattleman but a genuinely gifted drover, with a naturalistic understanding of how cattle move and think, and how to guide them across long distances with the minimum of stress to the animals and the people managing them. He knew when to push and when to ease off, when to ride wide around the herd and when to come in close, and he communicated all of this to Fannie in a way that was instructive without being condescending, sharing his knowledge as one rancher to another. They brought in 2 additional day hands from town for the drive itself, brothers named Will and Pete Garfield, who were young and loud and enthusiastic in the way of young men who have not yet acquired the useful caution that comes with experience, but who were capable workers, and who fell naturally into Homer's easy authority without any friction, which said something good about both Homer and the Garfield brothers. The morning they set out for Amarillo was gray and cool, with a smell of rain somewhere over the western horizon, and Fannie stood in the yard in the early light watching Homer, and the Garfield brothers moved the herd out of the pasture and onto the road south, and she felt the complicated, exhilarating weight of what this drive meant. Not just the money, though the money was essential. But the proof of it, the proof that she had kept this place alive, and that this herd was intact and healthy and moving, and that she had done what everyone in Dalhart had said quietly among themselves that she could not do. Eli stood beside her and watched the cattle go and then looked up at her. "Are we going too?" he asked. "We are," she said. "Get your hat." She had not intended to make the full drive herself, had thought perhaps she would see the herd off and then manage the ranch from the home place while Homer and the Garfield brothers drove the cattle down. But something in the morning air and in the sight of Homer on his gray roan moving the lead steers out onto the road had changed that intention without her quite deciding to change it. Mrs. Ruth Mackey from the neighboring property, who was a practical and generous woman in the way of people who have been through hard things and come out the other side of them without bitterness, agreed to look in on the home place and the remaining horses while they were gone, and so Fannie and Eli joined the drive. It was 4 days to the buying yards outside Amarillo, traveling roughly south and slightly east through the grassland and scrub of the Panhandle, camping each night under a sky so enormous and so dense with stars that even Eli, who was accustomed to the Panhandle sky, went quiet looking up at it in a way that suggested he was thinking about something that he did not quite have words for yet. On the second night, camped along a dry creek bed with the cattle settled and the Garfield brothers asleep and Eli unconscious in his bedroll with Preacher's considerable weight pressed against him, Homer and Fannie sat by the fire that had burned down to coals, 2 cups of coffee between them, and the night around them was cool and enormous and very quiet except for the breathing of cattle and the far-off sound of a coyote working the darkness. "Can I ask you something?" Fannie said. "Yes," he said. "Why did you come to the Lawson Ranch, specifically? There must have been other work available." He looked at the coals for a moment. "There was other work available," he agreed. "The Hendricks spread over near Wheeler was looking for hands, better pay than what you offered." "Then why?" He was quiet in the way she had come to recognize as thinking rather than evasion. "Your sign said honest work, honest pay," he said. "Most signs like that leave off the honest part. People figure it goes without saying, which generally means it does not go without saying and they just do not want to commit to it. Yours said it directly." He paused. "And I heard in town that the woman who put it up had kept her ranch running alone for nearly a year, and that the county was waiting for her to fail, and that she had not failed yet. That interested me." Fannie looked at the coals. "That interested you?" "Yes. Not the cattle work or the pay. Those too," he said, "but mostly the woman who had not failed yet." She felt the warmth of it move through her, clear and clean as spring water. She had not been looked at like that, spoken to like that in a very long time, and what struck her was how different it felt from what she might have expected, different from the bruising loneliness of the past year, and different from the gentle, bewildered grief that had sat in her chest since Cal died. This felt like something moving forward rather than something looking back, and she had the disorienting, somewhat frightening sensation of wanting it. "Homer," she said. "Yes." She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. "What is it you want?" she said. "From this, from being here?" He did not look away. He did not reach for a simpler answer or a safer one. He said, "More than one season." The fire popped softly between them and a steer shifted somewhere in the darkness and the coyote was gone now and the silence was so complete and so full that it felt almost like a presence itself, like the land was listening. "My husband has been dead less than a year," she said. Not as a refusal, but as the honest thing that had to be said, the thing that was real and could not be walked around. "I know," he said. "I do not know what I am yet," she said. "Without him, without what I was when I was his wife, I have been so busy trying to survive that I have not had time to figure out who I am now." "I know that too," he said. "I am not asking you to know those things tonight." "What are you asking?" He looked at her with a steadiness that was not pressure but invitation. "I am asking if you will let me stay long enough to find out." She looked back at the coals. The sky above them was deep black with stars so dense they blurred at the edges, and the grass stretched out all around them in every direction under that sky. And she was 32 years old, and she had a son who was sleeping 20 feet away with his father's face, and an old dog pressed against his side. And the whole panhandle was dark and breathing around her. And she thought about what it had cost her to put that sign on the post, the courage of that simple act of asking for help, of admitting she could not do it entirely alone. She thought about Homer nailing the fence posts back into the red earth in the rain, not because he had to, but because the work needed doing and he was there. She thought about the way he looked at Eli without condescension, the way he said good, when she told him she had sent that awful man off her property. She thought about the way he looked at her across the fire just now, not with the hungry urgency of a lonely man who wants something from her, but with the patient, warm, particular attention of someone who has been waiting for something worth waiting for and has found himself, unexpectedly, in its vicinity. "You have a job here through the end of June," she said carefully, "when the drive is done and the summer grazing is set." "Yes," he said. "After that the arrangement would have to change." "Yes," he said again, and the word was full of understanding, full of everything he meant and everything he was willing to wait for. "Then yes," she said. "Stay." The drive reached Amarillo on the afternoon of the fourth day, and the buying yards at the southern edge of the city were busy and loud, and smelled powerfully of cattle and livestock, and the industrial business of moving animals from range to market. And Fannie sat straight in the saddle beside Homer while their herd was counted and assessed. And when the buyer came back with his number, she looked at Homer, and Homer looked at the number and then looked at her and gave a small, approving nod that said it was fair. And she said yes, and they shook hands with the buyer and it was done. The money she received was more than she had hoped for and precisely what she needed. It would carry the ranch through the following winter with room enough to expand the herd by spring. And if the following year's drive went as well, she would be beyond the worst of the financial uncertainty that had dogged her since Cal's death, truly beyond it, standing on solid ground of her own making. She stood outside the buying yards with the banker's draft in her hand and Eli next to her and Homer just behind, and she felt the full weight of what she had done settle over her, not the exhausting weight of obligation and fear that she had been carrying for 11 months, but the entirely different weight of completion, of having set out to do a hard thing and having done it. She put her face up to the afternoon sun and closed her eyes and breathed in the hot, animal, working smell of Amarillo and felt something inside her that had been clenched since last May slowly, carefully, begin to release. "Mama," Eli said, "are you all right?" "I am more than all right," she said. She opened her eyes and looked at Homer, who was standing with his hat in his hands and looking at her with an expression of uncomplicated, genuine gladness, not for any reason related to himself, but entirely for her sake, the look of a person who takes real joy in someone else's good thing. And she thought that if she had any lingering doubt about the direction she had decided to move in, that look was the end of it. They spent one night in Amarillo before starting the return drive, which without the herd was naturally much faster. And while the Garfield brothers found their entertainment in the saloon on the main street, Homer and Fannie and Eli walked down the town's wide main avenue in the late evening looking at the shop windows and eating the sugar-glazed pecans sold from a cart by a Mexican woman who called Eli muchacho and pressed extra nuts into his hands with the warm, automatic generosity of someone who likes children without any complicated reasons. Eli held his pecans and walked between them, sometimes holding Fannie's hand and sometimes holding Homer's, as if the most natural arrangement in the world was to be walking down this street between these two people. And Fannie looked across the top of his head at Homer, and Homer looked back at her, and something passed between them in that glance that was full and warm and required no words at all. They were home at the Lawson Ranch by the end of June's second week. The property looked good in the summer light, the grass heavy and the fences clean and the barn and bunkhouse solid against the big sky. Mrs. Mackey had looked after everything admirably and reported that all was well, And she looked at Homer and then at Fanny and then back at Homer with the shrewd, affectionate appraisal of a woman who has been alive long enough to recognize what she is looking at and chose to say nothing about it except, "You have got yourself a good one there, Fannie Lawson," and then climbed back on her horse and rode home. The season, technically, was over. The drive was done. The summer grazing was set. Homer's contracted period of employment was finished. He spent 3 days working around the ranch without any mention of leaving, doing the kind of work that does not get done during the urgent season, small repairs and maintenance, tightening the hinges on the barn door and cleaning the tack and checking the horse's feet, and reorganizing the feed storage in a way that would make the autumn easier. Fanny watched him and did not say anything about the season being done, and he did not say anything about it either. On the evening of the 3rd day after their return, while Eli was doing his lessons at the kitchen table and the supper was cooking, and the light coming through the windows was that long, golden, summer evening light that makes everything look like it belongs in a painting, Homer came in from outside and stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands the way he always did when he had something to say. "I have been thinking," he said. "So have I," she said. "I should say what I am thinking out loud." "Yes," she said, "you should." He looked at her steadily. "I know the season is finished," he said. "I know that what we agreed to was one season and I have worked it honestly and you have paid me honestly and we are square. But I am not ready to leave this place, Fanny. I am not ready to leave you." She turned from the stove and faced him fully. "I have been on my own for a long time," he said. "Moving from one outfit to the next, doing good work and being paid for it and moving on. And I did not think a great deal about it being lonely because it was just the shape of my life and I did not have a different shape to compare it to. But this place, and you, and Eli, this is a different shape. This is the shape that things are supposed to be, I think." He stopped for a moment. "I'm not asking out of convenience, or because it suits me financially, or because I need a place to stay. I am asking because I have been falling in love with you since the first morning I was here, and I would rather spend the rest of my life on this ground with you than go anywhere else on earth." The kitchen was very quiet. Eli, who had gone entirely still over his lessons in the way of a child who is pretending not to hear, had in fact stopped breathing. Fanny looked at Homer for a long moment. His face was open in a way she had rarely seen it, all the patience and carefulness stripped back to show what was underneath. And what was underneath was a man who wanted something enough to make himself completely vulnerable for it, which she knew from her own experience was not a small thing. "What are you asking me specifically, Homer?" she said. "I am asking you to marry me," he said. "I am asking you for a lifetime." Eli made a sound that was either a gasp or a suppressed squeak of excitement, and was possibly both. She walked across the kitchen until she was standing directly in front of him, close enough that she could see the lamp light in his dark eyes, and the way his jaw was set with a tension that was hope and fear in equal measure. She reached out and took his hand, the rough, calloused, capable hand that had built her fences and driven her herd and handed her son extra biscuits at supper and quietly, faithfully, remade the whole shape of her life over the course of one single season. "Yes," she said. "I am asking you to." He stared at her. "You are asking me." "I am asking you to stay," she said, "to stay and build this with me and Eli. I am not asking for anything except that, and I know what I am asking is larger than one season." Something broke open in his face, the last careful reservation, the last held-back part of what he felt, and it was so unguarded and so genuine and so completely without pretense that she had to blink against the sudden brightness of it. "Then yes," he said, "every season left in me." Eli fell entirely off his chair, and the kitchen filled with the sound of it. And then Fanny was laughing and Homer was laughing, and Eli scrambled up from the floor with his hair in his face and his lesson book in his hand, and flung himself at both of them at once, wrapping his arms around as much of them as he could reach. And the evening outside the windows went gold and deep, and the first stars were just beginning to show at the edges of the sky. They were married 6 weeks later on a Saturday morning at the small white church on the edge of Dalhart that had been built in 1879, and whose minister, a gentle, broad-shouldered man named Reverend Calloway, had a voice like distant thunder and a genuine enthusiasm for performing wedding ceremonies that he made no effort to conceal. The church was full because word had gotten around, as word always gets around in small Texas towns, and the people who came were mostly people who had watched Fannie Lawson survive the hardest year of her life and who were, for the most part, and with a few notable exceptions, genuinely glad to see her happy. Ruth Mackey cried through the entire ceremony from the third pew and did not pretend otherwise. The Garfield brothers wore their best shirts and sat in the back, and were on their best behavior except that Pete Garfield dropped his hat twice during the vows, which made a noise each time, and which he responded to with apologies so urgent and sincere that the resulting laughter from the congregation was unavoidable and thoroughly broke the gravity of the moment, which Fanny privately felt was more appropriate to who she and Homer actually were than solemnity would have been. Eli stood next to Homer at the front of the church with his hair combed and his boots clean, and when Reverend Calloway got to the part about who gives this woman in matrimony, and there was a small, old-fashioned pause for the answer, Eli said clearly, from right there next to Homer, "We do," which was not part of the traditional ceremony, but which was so entirely correct that Reverend Calloway simply smiled and moved on. Homer put the ring on Fanny's finger, a plain gold band that he had bought from the jeweler in Amarillo during their one night in the city, had kept in his pocket for 6 weeks, and which fit her finger as if it had been made for it, which it had, because he had measured the circumference of her ring finger on the third day of the drive using a strip of paper and a pencil while she was looking the other direction, a piece of foresight that she found, when she learned of it later, to be one of the most unexpectedly romantic things she had ever heard of. Fanny looked up at him when the ring was on, and his face was very close, and his eyes were the same dark, steady, honest eyes that had come riding down her dirt road in April, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that the season she had hired him for had ended up being the beginning of something she had no word for, something larger and more permanent than seasons, something built to last past weather and grief, and the opinions of people who thought they knew what a woman alone could or could not do. Reverend Calloway said, "You may kiss your bride," and Homer did briefly and with great care, the way a man kisses a woman when he is in a church full of people, and also aware that they have a great deal more time alone ahead of them and is therefore in no particular rush. And when they pulled back from each other, Fanny was smiling so hard her face ached with it. The reception was held in the yard behind the church, where Ruth Mackey and several other women from town had set up tables with food, and someone had brought a fiddle player, not the same one from the spring market, but a younger man named Chavez who could play at least 12 songs and played them all beautifully. And the afternoon turned into an evening full of food and music, and the kind of easy, genuine social warmth that happens when people have come together not out of obligation, but out of actual gladness. Homer danced with Fanny twice, both times with a certainty and gentleness that was entirely characteristic of him, one hand at her waist and one hand holding hers and his eyes on her face with the undivided, uncomplicated attention that she had come to depend on as one of the reliable features of her days. She did not think of herself as someone who needed to be looked at, not in the way some women did, but being seen by Homer, being known by him, being the person whose voice he turned toward in a room, was a specific and essential pleasure that she understood now she had been going without for a long time and did not intend to go without again. They danced a third time, slow and unhurried in the summer evening, and she put her cheek against his shoulder and felt the solid warmth of him and thought about April, about the gray roan horse coming down the road, and the sign nailed to the post, and the terrifying, necessary act of asking for help. She thought about how small the ask had seemed on the surface and how large what it had grown into. She thought about how strange and fortuitous and entirely ordinary the whole thing was. A woman needed help. A man came and offered it. And then they fell in love the way people have been falling in love since the beginning of things, through proximity and attention and honesty, and the gradual, daily revelation of character. The summer settled over the Lawson ranch with a full, generous heat, and the grass grew thick in the pastures, and the herd fattened on it. And Homer and Fannie worked the ranch together in a partnership that was equal and practical and full of the particular pleasure of shared labor between two people who respect each other's competence. There were things she did better than him and things he did better than her, and they had understood this from the beginning without any need to negotiate it, because it was simply true and truth was what they had always operated on. Eli took to calling Homer by his first name. Then, after the wedding, shifted to Pop in a way that was tentative at first, and then, when Homer received it with quiet, undemonstrative gladness, became entirely natural. Homer was careful always to honor Cal's memory in Eli's presence, never diminishing or competing with a dead man, but simply being present in the way that a living one can be, which is to say, consistently and warmly, and with the particular constancy of someone who has made a choice and does not second-guess it. There was one evening in August when Eli asked Homer, directly and without preamble as he was apt to do, whether Homer thought his daddy would have liked him. Homer was quiet for a moment in the way he always was when the honest answer required care, and then he said, "I think your daddy would have wanted someone here who would take good care of your mama and of this land. I aim to do that. Whether he would have liked me I cannot say for certain, but I think any man worth knowing would respect another man who loves what he loves and takes care of what he cares for." Eli thought about this for a long time and then said, "I think he would have liked you." And then he went back to whatever he had been doing, entirely settled, as if that had been the last piece of an equation he had been working on since April. Fannie, who had been in the next room and had heard every word of it, went out to the porch and stood in the August heat with her hand pressed flat against her sternum, feeling the fullness of it, the way a heart can be full of grief and gratitude and love all at the same time, without any of them canceling the others out. The autumn came in cool and golden, and the second grazing season ended well, and they began planning the spring drive for the following year with a herd that was larger by 8 head, which was a good thing, and which Homer predicted would be larger by 10 or 12 more by the time the calves came in spring, which was a better thing. The finances of the ranch were stable in a way they had not been since Cal's death, not comfortable in any excessive sense but steady, which was what she had wanted, what she had asked for when she put that sign on the post, a way to make the land survive, and with it the life she and Eli were building on it. In November she realized she was expecting. She held the knowledge quietly for several days before telling Homer, not from any reluctance, but because she wanted a few days alone with it, a private, interior tenderness before it became something shared and spoken, and therefore subject to all the practical considerations that followed. She was aware, in those few days, of a happiness so particular and so unexpected that it felt almost impossible to hold without spilling, the happiness of someone who had spent a year with their head down fighting to keep the ground under their feet, and who looked up one day and found themselves standing somewhere entirely different from where the fighting had been, somewhere warm and solid and built for living. She told Homer on a Sunday evening while Eli was asleep and the house was quiet and the stove was warm and the wind was coming down from the north the way it did in November, pushing against the windows with a sound like breath. She said simply, "We are going to have a child." Homer looked at her. He was at the kitchen table with a piece of tack he had been oiling, and he set it down slowly and looked at her with a look that was so open and so full that she could see every single thing he felt moving through it, wonder and tenderness and a fierce, protective joy, and something very deep underneath all of it that she had no word for except love, which seemed too small a word for what was in his face, but was the most accurate one she had. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and took her face in both his hands and kissed her with a completeness and a deliberateness that said everything that his face had been saying. And when he pulled back, his eyes were very bright, and she was laughing, and he was laughing, and the wind pushed at the windows, and the stove crackled, and the whole warm interior of the house held them both. "A child," he said, as if learning the word. "In the spring," she said. "Late April or early May by my reckoning." He kept his hands on her face and looked at her as if he were looking at something that regularly exceeded his capacity to describe. "Fannie," he said. "I know," she said. She told Eli the next morning. He was eating his breakfast and he went very still when she said it, the way he sometimes did when he was processing information that was large. He looked at his biscuit for a long time and then he looked up at her and said, "Is it going to be a boy or a girl?" "I do not know yet," she said. He considered this. "I would like a brother," he said, with the practical directness of a child who has had enough time with his own wishes to know them clearly. "But I will also be glad about a sister." "That is very gracious of you," Homer said from across the table, with the particular contained quality in his voice that meant he was working hard not to laugh. And Eli looked at him with a suspicious expression that suggested he understood the amusement and had decided to allow it. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was cold but not punishing, and the ranch held well through it. The herd kept close and healthy, the home place warm against the north winds. They spent the long evenings inside with the lamp burning and the stove going, and Homer read aloud sometimes from the 2 books he had carried in his saddlebag all those riding years. A collected volume of natural history by a man named Wood that Eli found utterly absorbing, and a thin book of verse by Tennyson that Fannie read herself on the evenings Homer was occupied with something else, and that she found unexpectedly consoling in its density and its strangeness. Homer and Fannie fell into the intimate, unhurried rhythms of a marriage between 2 people who have chosen each other with full knowledge and no illusions, which is to say they argued sometimes, briefly and honestly, about real things, the arrangement of the calving schedule or the management of the accounts, or whether the south pasture fence needed reinforcing before spring, and they resolved those arguments with the same directness they brought to everything else, and then moved on. And the moving on was easy because there was no accumulated resentment beneath it, no stored-up grievances waiting for the next disagreement to expand into. He learned her particular silences, which were different from each other in meaningful ways, and she learned his, and they developed the vocabulary of long acquaintance at a speed that struck both of them sometimes as remarkable, as if they had been practicing for this partnership for longer than the calendar could account for. She learned that he could not fall asleep if he was worried about something he had not yet addressed, and that the right response was not reassurance, but rather to solve the problem together or at least to make a plan for solving it, and that once a plan was in place he could rest. He learned that she needed the first 20 minutes of each day to herself before she was ready to talk to anyone, and that the right response was to simply be there, quietly, in the same space, which was close enough together to satisfy her while leaving her the privacy she needed to become fully herself in the mornings. They were, in the specific and technical sense of the word, good for each other, and they knew it, and the knowing of it added to the warmth rather than diminishing it. January and February passed with their particular austerity, and March came in with the first real hope of warmth, and the grass began its tentative return, and the calves started arriving in the way they do, one after another with an urgency that required attention and work, and the peculiar exhausted joy of bringing new animals into the world. Homer was up at all hours during calving season, checking the herd by lantern light in the cold dark, and Fannie managed the home place and the accounts and the cooking and Eli's lessons, and kept the coffee strong and hot for whenever Homer came in. By the time April warmed the ground and the panhandle sky went that particular shade of high blue that it only achieves in spring, they had 12 new calves, and the herd was the strongest it had been since Fannie had taken ownership of it. The baby came on May 2nd, 1883, just about a year to the date after Cal Lawson had died, which Fannie acknowledged to herself with the complicated feeling of someone for whom time has layered loss and birth in a way that cannot be separated into neat compartments, but must simply be held in its full complexity and accepted as part of the shape of a life. The labor was attended by the town's midwife, a capable and plain-spoken woman named Mrs. Ava Dennett, who had brought more than 40 babies into the world in the Panhandle, and had a calm, competent manner that Fannie found deeply reassuring. Homer waited in the kitchen through the long hours of it in a state of controlled but visible anxiety, and Eli, who had been told the night before that the baby was coming very soon, sat next to him at the kitchen table and handed him coffee with the solemn concentration of someone who understood that what was required here was quiet support and had decided to provide it. The baby announced himself in the early morning hours with a loud, declarative cry that carried all the way through the house, and Mrs. Dennett came to the kitchen door and said, "You have a son, Mr. Norris. A very healthy, very loud son." And Homer stood up from the table so fast he knocked his chair back and then caught it with a speed that indicated his hands were working considerably faster than his conscious mind. He held his son for the first time standing beside Fannie's bed in the pale, early morning light, the baby wrapped in the blanket that had been Eli's and before that had been someone else's in some earlier chapter of the household's history. And the look on Homer's face was the look of a man encountering something that reorders everything he previously understood about what things mean. He held the child with the careful competence of a man whose hands are accustomed to managing things that require gentleness, and he looked at his son with that look, and then he looked at Fannie, and his face was so completely unguarded that she had the feeling she was seeing him more clearly than she had ever seen anyone. "What shall we call him?" Homer said. Fannie had thought about this. "Cal," she said, "if you do not object, Cal Homer Norris." He was quiet for a moment and she watched his face. He looked down at the baby and then back at her. "I do not object," he said. "I think that is exactly right." Eli appeared in the doorway, having been told by Mrs. Dennett that he could come see his brother now, and he stood in the doorway in his nightshirt with his hair standing up from sleep and looked at the bundle in Homer's arms with an expression of extreme seriousness, as if he were undertaking a full assessment. "He is very small," Eli observed. "He will grow," Homer said. "Does he have all his fingers?" "All 10. Eli nodded, apparently satisfied by this. He came to the side of the bed, and Fannie pulled him close with one arm and he leaned against her and looked at his brother. "Hello, Cal," he said formally. The baby, being 11 minutes old and therefore unaware of the social requirements of introductions, said nothing. "He will talk eventually," Eli said, to no one in particular, and this time Homer did laugh. The quiet, real laugh that Fannie had first heard in her kitchen weeks ago, and that had become one of the reliable, warm things of her life. And she laughed too, from inside the tiredness and the tenderness of the morning, and the sound of both of them filled the room along with the light coming through the window and the baby making small, indeterminate sounds that were not words yet, but were the preliminary steps toward them. The summer of 1883 was the best summer the Lawson Ranch had known in years, or perhaps it was simply that Fannie had more reason to notice the goodness of things than she had in recent memory. The herd was strong, the grass was good, the calves from spring were growing well. The spring drive to Amarillo had gone smoothly, managed this time with such practiced confidence that even the Garfield brothers, who had come back for a second season and were somewhat less reckless than the first time, remarked that the Norris outfit ran a tighter, easier drive than most of the larger operations they had worked for. Homer and Fannie had begun to talk in the evenings about expanding. Not recklessly and not beyond their means, but thoughtfully, with the kind of long-view planning that is only possible when the immediate crisis is resolved, and the ground is stable enough to think past the next season. There was additional land adjacent to the north pasture that the county was offering at a reasonable price, land that would nearly double their grazing capacity, and allow them to grow the herd to a size that would make the ranch genuinely prosperous rather than merely solvent. They spent several evenings working through the figures together at the kitchen table, with the lamp burning and baby Cal asleep in the cradle that Homer had built in the February cold from lumber and skill, and the particular focused care of a man making something that matters. The figures were close, closer than comfortable but workable if the next two drives went as well as the current one had. "It is a risk," Fannie said, on the third evening of considering it. "Yes," Homer said. "I have not been in a position to take risks for a long time. I know," he looked at her across the table, "but this is not the kind of risk that can ruin you if it does not work. At worst, we carry the debt 2 more seasons and do not expand the herd as fast as we planned. That is a setback, not a disaster. You have thought about it carefully." "I think about everything carefully." She knew this about him, had known it from the first week, the deliberateness of him, the way he assessed a situation completely before committing to it, and the way that once he committed he did not half commit. It was one of the things she trusted most about him. "All right," she said. "We will make the offer on the land." He looked at her steadily. "You are sure?" "I am sure," she said. "I have been sure for a while. I was waiting to see if you would push me toward it or if you would let me come to it on my own." Something moved through his expression that was part acknowledgement and part rueful amusement. "You are testing me even now." "Occasionally," she admitted. "Less than I did in April." He reached across the table and took her hand, the simple, natural gesture that had become part of the grammar of their days, and squeezed it once. "I will ride out to the county office in the morning," he said. "Good," she said, and the word echoed back across many months to the first time he had said it to her. One word carrying the weight of a complete understanding, and she saw in his face that he heard the echo too. They made the offer on the North Land, and the offer was accepted. And by the following spring, the expanded pasture was fenced, and the herd moved through it with the unhurried confidence of cattle that know good grass. And the Norris spread, as it was beginning to be called in the county, was becoming one of the more quietly respected operations in the Eastern Panhandle. Eli turned 9 that summer and had become, over the past year and a half, a boy of considerable competence for his age, already helping with the lighter end of the cattle work, already beginning to develop the particular relationship with horses that comes from being taught by someone who knows them well. Homer taught him the same way he did everything, patiently and thoroughly, and with the understanding that real learning comes from doing rather than being told. He never hurried Eli and never belittled a mistake, only showed him where it had occurred and why and what to do differently. And Eli absorbed it all with the focused seriousness that was his characteristic mode of engagement with the world. Fannie watched her son becoming a young man, and she thought of Cal, his father, with the particular ache of someone who knows the price of absence. And she also thought of Homer, who was present in all the daily ways that matter. And she felt the complicated, generous truth that love is not a fixed quantity that diminishes when it is divided, but rather a thing that grows in the giving. Cal Homer Norris, called Little Cal by everyone except Eli, who called him the baby, until he was well past the age when that was accurate, grew at the enthusiastic rate of a well-fed, well-loved infant becoming a toddler, and the household adjusted itself around his presence in the way households do, rearranging its patterns and priorities to accommodate a small person who has clear and immediate opinions about everything, but the vocabulary to express only a fraction of them. By the winter of 1883, he was walking, badly but determinedly, across the floors of the ranch house, falling down and getting up with the philosophical equanimity of someone who has not yet developed any expectation that walking should be easy. Homer sat on the kitchen floor one January evening, helping little Cal navigate the distance between the table leg and the chair. And Fannie, watching them from the doorway, thought again about April, about the gray roan horse and the sign on the post, and the $212 in the tin box under the floor, and about the extraordinary contingency of things, how everything that mattered had come from a single practical act of necessity. how the whole shape of her life had pivoted on a hand-painted sign, and the particular morning, a particular man decided to ride down her road instead of someone else's. She went to where Homer was sitting on the floor and sat down beside him, and he looked over at her and she leaned her shoulder against his, and they watched little Cal triumphantly complete the 4-foot journey from table leg to chair and grab the chair with both hands, and look back at them with an expression of absolute self-satisfaction that made them both laugh. Eli appeared from the other room and regarded his brother's achievement with the brotherly enthusiasm that manages to be both genuine and slightly competitive. "He has been trying that all afternoon," he said. "I know," Homer said. "I saw him start it before supper. He kept falling down." "Yes, and kept getting up." Eli considered this. "That is something, I suppose." "It is everything," Homer said. Fannie looked at her husband's profile in the lamplight, the strong, weathered, honest face that she knew now the way she knew her own land, thoroughly and tenderly, and with the specific knowledge that only comes from time and from paying attention. And she thought that she could not have told you, in April of 1882, what she was asking for when she nailed that sign to the post. She had thought she was asking for labor, for practical help through one hard season, for someone to ride the fence line and drive the cattle and give her enough time to get her feet under her. She had not known she was asking for this, for all of it, for the long table and the lamplight and the baby on the floor and the 8-year-old in the doorway and the man beside her, who held her face the same way he held the land and everything on it, with both hands and without reservation. But here it was anyway, all of it, not in spite of what she had gone through, but somehow constructed from the materials of it, built from the grief and the necessity, and the courage of asking for help, and the grace of the right person showing up to give it. In the spring of 1884, Fannie discovered she was expecting again. She told Homer on a morning in March when the calves were coming, and the north pasture was full, and the horizon was that particular electric shade of pre-storm green that means weather is building somewhere to the west. And he received the news the same way he received everything that came from her, with his full and unhurried attention, and a look that said she was the most important thing in the immediate vicinity of his sight. Which was a feeling she had long since stopped trying to have words for because it did not need them. "Another Norris," he said. "Another Norris," she agreed. He pulled her close and held her the way he sometimes did, both arms around her and his chin at her temple, and she could feel him breathing and feel the warmth coming through his shirt and hear, distantly, the sounds of the ranch in the morning, cattle and horses, and the particular creak of the windmill in the west pasture that needed oiling, and that she had been meaning to mention to him for a week. "The windmill needs oiling," she said, from inside the embrace. He made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. "You are a remarkably practical woman, Fannie Norris." "I prefer to think of it as efficient," she said. "I can be romantic and practical in the same breath. It saves time." He kissed the top of her head. "Yes," he said, "you can." The baby came in October, a second boy, whom they named James after Homer's father, and who arrived with considerably less drama than his brother had, being apparently in a hurry to see what all the activity in the house was about. Eli, now 10, received James with the practiced authority of someone who has been through this before, and has opinions about how it should be handled. And little Cal, 18 months old and possessed of very strong territorial feelings, took approximately 2 weeks to come to terms with the arrangement before deciding that his brother was acceptable and possibly even interesting. The house grew fuller and louder and warmer, and Fannie moved through it daily with the particular grace of a woman who has found the place where she is supposed to be and is no longer in any doubt about it. She still rode her land every week, still managed the accounts with the same careful exactness she always had, still nailed the fences herself when Homer was occupied elsewhere and the work needed doing, still sat up late in the evenings when something required thinking through, with the lamp burning and the coffee cold, and the paper in front of her. Because some things about a person do not change, no matter how much else does, and this was one of them. Homer was always there, the steadiness of him a given, a constant that she could orient by the way the cattle oriented by the windmill, the way the grass oriented toward the light. He was a good man in the old-fashioned sense of the word, the sense that means something beyond the absence of bad qualities, the sense that means active and deliberate and directed goodness, the kind of goodness you can feel the foundation of a life resting on without any anxiety about whether it will hold. On a Saturday afternoon in the October following James's birth, when the baby was asleep and little Cal was with Mrs. Mackey next door and Eli was riding the south fence on his own for the first time, a task he had been asking for and preparing for, and was entirely ready for, Homer and Fannie stood together on the porch of the ranch house in the autumn light, looking out at the land that was now more than 1,000 acres of good panhandle earth, green where the grass still held and gold where it had cured for winter, the herd moving slow and dark in the south pasture. It was the same sky she had grown up under, the same enormous Texas sky that went all the way to the edges of things, but it looked different now, or perhaps she looked at it differently from the inside of a life she had chosen and built and defended and inhabited fully, rather than from inside a grief that was doing its best to be everything. "You know what I was thinking about today," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I was thinking about the sign," she said. "The one I put up. Honest work, honest pay." One season. He was quiet for a moment watching the herd, and I think it was the most important thing I ever did, she said, asking that specifically. Putting it out there in plain language and waiting to see who came. He looked at her then, sidelong, with that quiet, dark-eyed look that she had been reading correctly for 2.5 years now. "I am glad you asked," he said. "So am I," she said, "and I am glad you asked back." He reached over and took her hand on the porch railing, his rough, warm, honest hand over hers, and they stood together in the October light looking out at the land they had made theirs together. The long grass and the cattle and the clean line of fence posts stretching all the way to the edge of where you could see. And somewhere behind them in the house the baby stirred and made a sound, and somewhere out across the south pasture Eli was a small figure on a good horse doing his first solo work. And the windmill turned slowly in the west, and the sky went on and on and on above all of it, blue and clear and entirely without end. It had been one season she had asked for, one season of work. He had asked for a lifetime before that season was over, and here it was, the lifetime, in all its particular, ordinary, extraordinary dailiness, built in the full sight of the panhandle sky from the materials of need and honesty and work, and the specific, irreducible fact of two people who had found in each other the shape that everything was supposed to be. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. The wind came down from the north the way it always did, carrying the smell of grass and distance, and the cattle moved slowly in the golden afternoon, and the ranch held, as it had been holding for 3 years now, as she fully intended it to go on holding, through every season that followed, every spring drive and winter cold and new birth and old grief and daily, accumulating grace of a life lived honestly and together, and in full possession of the extraordinary thing that ordinary days, stacked one upon another in the company of the right person, eventually become.